2 in the morning, 28 weeks pregnant, Annalise Whitaker lay alone in bed while her husband's pillows stayed untouched. Rowan was always late, always distant, always hiding something. Then one night, she heard his laugh downstairs as another woman's voice inside her home. But Annalise doesn't scream. She started documenting everything. This is a story about betrayal, quiet strength, and the moment a woman stops performing in someone else's life and finally chooses her. If this story touched your heart, please support the channel with 1 like and 1 share so we can keep creating more meaningful stories. Thanks for watching.
The baby kicked again at 2 in the morning. Annalise Whitaker lay flat on her back in the dark, her hand pressed against her belly, just waiting. 28 weeks. The books all called this the active phase, but the books never mention that you'll be alone for most of it. Bedroom door shut, ceiling clicking with every turn, and the smell of whatever she had microwaved for dinner still lingering from the kitchen because the ventilation in this house was just awful. Another kick, this one harder. I know, she thought. I'm awake, too. She rolled onto her side, glancing at the clock. 2:07. The other side of the bed was perfectly made. Rowan's pillow was untouched. She had ironed the pillowcase herself last Sunday. Some old habit from the early years, back when she did things like that. The fold lines were still sharp and perfect. She grabbed her phone. No messages. She put it back down, screen up, and stared at the ceiling. Then she picked it up again and flipped it screen down. 3 years ago, she would have told you she was lucky, and she would have actually believed it. Rowan Whitaker just had a way of making you feel chosen, and it wasn't about big speeches or bouquets of flowers. That wasn't his style. It was much more subtle. The way he'd remember you mentioned one time 6 weeks ago that you liked oat milk in your coffee. The way he'd know you were tired before you even said a word. He was 14 years older, and at 26, Annalisa saw that age gap as maturity, as stability. Her mother used very different words. Her mother had said, "He's almost as old as your father." And Annalisa didn't return her calls for 2 weeks. They were married in September. It was a small ceremony, Rowan's choice. His firm paid for the reception, a converted warehouse in the Pearl District that cost more per hour than Annalisa made in a whole week back then. 40 guests. She'd wanted 65. He told her 65 was excessive. She just said, okay. She said okay to a lot of things back then. Portland in November has this particular kind of gray that just sinks into your bones. Not dramatic. Not the dark purple gray of a storm, just flat and constant, like a sky that had given up. Anna grew up there. She knew every single shade of that sky. She'd been working from home since week 18. Her doctor had suggested it to reduce stress after her blood pressure was high at a checkup. She never told Rowan the real reason she was working from home. She just told him she was, and he never asked why. That was the first thing she really started to notice. It wasn't the late nights. Those had been going on for years, the life of a man running his own architecture firm, always trying to impress people she would never even meet. It wasn't the way he'd flip his phone over when she walked in the room. She saw those things, but told herself she was just being paranoid, that her hormones were making her crazy. It was the little things. The way he stopped asking how she was feeling. It wasn't sudden. He was never the most attentive guy, but there was always something. A hand on her back, a quick, "How's the stomach today?" in the morning. That all disappeared around week 22, and she didn't even notice until she was standing in the shower one day, trying to remember the last time he'd actually touched her stomach. She couldn't remember. The coffee maker on the counter was from their first year of marriage, and it still sounded like an animal dying. It would wheeze and gurgle, and then give one last rattle before spitting out a cup of coffee. That was always just a little too weak. She'd asked Rowan about replacing it twice. He said he'd look into it. She stopped asking. The Tuesday it all really started felt completely ordinary. She was at the kitchen table with her laptop, one leg tucked under her in a way she knew her back would hate later. Rain tapped against the window over the sink. On her screen was a spreadsheet for a client meeting she had to prepare her for by the end of the week. But she hadn't been able to focus all morning. The Henderson's dog next door was making that sound it always did when it rained, a low, constant whine. It wasn't really a bark, just a miserable noise that the fence did absolutely nothing to block. Annalise had stopped consciously hearing it a long time ago. It was just another sound in the house, like the third stair that always creaked or the guest bathroom faucet that dripped. Her phone buzzed. She looked. A reminder for her 3:30 doctor's appointment. She'd already told Rowan about it 2 weeks ago. She mentioned it again on Monday at breakfast. He nodded, said he'd try to make it work, then later sent a text saying, "Can't make Thursday." Client thing. "You okay to go alone?" she read. She typed back, "Of course," and just sat there with the phone in her hand for a minute before setting it down. She went alone. She sat in the waiting room next to a woman whose husband kept his hand on her back the whole time, rubbing little circles while she filled out forms. Annalisa stared at them for probably too long. The nurse finally called her name. She went in. Everything was fine. The baby was fine. Her blood pressure was still a little high. "Are you under any particular stress?" her doctor asked. "Not really," Annalisa lied. She started keeping a note in her phone. It wasn't on purpose. It started as a grocery list. And then, one night at 11 p.m., she added something that definitely wasn't groceries. Rowan came home at 10:40, said he was at the Morrow project meeting. Meeting was on his calendar from 6 to 8 p.m. She stared at the words for a while, and then just went to sleep. Over the next 2 weeks, that note got longer. Wednesday, cologne he left was different from the one in the bathroom. Friday, checked the joint credit card statement. Dinner for two at Ox, $214. I wasn't there. Monday called the firm to ask him to pick up prenatal vitamins. The receptionist said he'd left at 4. She didn't add any emotion to the list. No, what is happening, or I'm falling apart. Just facts, times, dates, and dollar amounts. Things that simply didn't add up. She'd always been good with spreadsheets. On the night of November 14th, she was already in bed when she heard his key in the front door. She glanced at her phone. 11:52 p.m., then she heard something that made her freeze. Laughter. His low laugh, the one he used when he was trying to be charming at a cocktail party. And under his laugh there was another voice, a woman's, and she wasn't on the phone. Not from the television he sometimes left on in the living room. She was in the house. Annalisa sat up slowly. She stayed there for a long moment in the dark, her hand flat on her stomach, just listening to the voices drift up from the living room below. The clink of glasses, a cabinet opening and closing. The liquor cabinet. She knew that sound. Music started playing, something soft and quiet that she didn't recognize. The baby moved. She pressed up gently. I know, she thought again. She got out of bed. Her feet felt the cold bathroom tile. She ran cold water over her wrists. A little trick she did when her chest felt tight, and she just stood there, looking at herself in the mirror. No makeup. Her hair needed to be washed. She was wearing an oversized t-shirt that used to be Rowan's before she stole it, and he never bothered to ask for it back. She looked tired. She was tired. From downstairs, the woman's laughter floated up again. It sounded easy, comfortable, like she already knew the layout of the house, like she'd been here before. Annalisa switched off the bathroom light and stood in the darkness for a moment. Then she opened her nightstand drawer. Inside, tucked under a book she couldn't focus on, and a frayed phone charger, was a folder. She had put it there 3 weeks ago, after the third doctor's appointment she went to alone, after the credit card bill, after the note on her phone had grown too long to fit on one screen. It wasn't divorce papers, not yet. It was just numbers. Bank statements she'd taken pictures of on her phone and printed at the public library. The credit card statement as a PDF. She was documenting everything, the way she always did when things mattered. She hadn't been sure if she would need it. She pulled the folder out and set it on the bed. The baby kicked again, harder this time, almost like punctuation. Downstairs, a glass clinked. Soon, Annalisa whispered to her belly. She put the folder on the nightstand where she could see it and lay back down in the dark, listening to the rain and the muffled voices from below. She did not sleep. The folder sat on the nightstand until 3 in the morning. Then she moved to the kitchen table. She didn't confront him that night, and honestly, that surprised her. The part of her raised on movies where women threw lamps and slammed doors and demanded answers in the middle of the night. She always figured that's what she would do. That switch would flip and she'd become that person. And she just laid in bed and listened to the voices downstairs until they stopped around 1 a.m., and then she heard footsteps coming up the stairs. Just one set of footsteps, and then the guest bedroom door down the hall opened and closed. Not their room, the guest room, as if that was supposed to mean something. She stared up at the ceiling. The fan clicked and clicked. It had been doing that for 8 months. She'd mentioned it to him twice. The morning came gray and wet, like Portland mornings always do in November, as if they had a quota to fill. Annalise was already sitting at the kitchen table when Rowan came downstairs at 7:15. He was dressed for work, his tie still undone, phone in his hand. He stopped short when he saw her. "You're up early," he said. "I didn't really sleep." He walked over to the coffee maker. The machine wheezed, gurgled. He watched it like it was personally betraying him. "How's the baby?" "Active." "Good." He poured his black coffee the same way he always took it. "It's a full day. I've got the Morrow Project review, then the Henderson pitch at 4. She just looked at him. "Someone was here last night." There was a pause. It wasn't long, but she had been listening for it. "A colleague," he said. "Caleth, she's on the Morrow Project. We had to go over some things. At midnight, it ran late." He picked up his coffee mug. "It's just work, Annalise." She nodded her head slowly. He knotted his tie in the mirror, grabbed his jacket, and walked out. The door clicked shut and she listened to his car pull out of the driveway. Then she opened her laptop. What she did next didn't make her proud. She would tell her therapist all about it later, in that quiet office in Portland with the sound machine humming outside. "I'm not proud of it," she'd say. And her therapist would reply, "You were trying to find the facts." And Annalise would say, "I was snooping." And her therapist would say, "Sometimes those are the same thing." She knew Rowan's email password. She'd known it for years. He gave it to her once when he was traveling and needed a file, and he just never changed. She had never used it, until now. She sat at the kitchen table as her coffee grew cold, and she read. It took 11 minutes to find what she was looking for, not because it was well hidden, because it was not. The email chain stretched back 4 months. It started out professionally project timelines, vendor contacts, the normal things you see in any inbox. But around the 3rd week, something shifted. It was small at first. An email that said, "I loved your idea in the meeting today," with nothing else attached. Another asking, "Are you free for lunch Thursday?" with no work text at all. Then a reply from Caleth Monroe. She had her full name now and could see her picture in the company directory. It said, "Always free for you." By the second it was no pretending. Annalise read the emails with the same cold precision she used to keep notes on her phone, not letting herself feel anything yet. She took screenshots of everything that mattered, dates, specific phrases, and a reference to a hotel in the Pearl District. She's immediately cross-referenced that with the credit card statement she'd already opened. November 3rd, $287, the Nines Hotel. She had been 3 weeks pregnant on November 3rd. She let that fact sink in. The rain started coming down harder. The neighbor's dog began to whine. She stood up, poured her cold coffee down the drain, and looked out at their backyard. She saw the patio furniture they bought two summers ago, but never really used. The tree that had lost all its leaves, and the garden she had meant to plant this spring before her world changed. She went back to the table and continued reading. According to the firm's website, Caleth Monroe was 30 years old, an associate architect. She'd gone to Brown University and then to graduate school in Los Angeles. Her photo showed a woman with sharp features and a direct gaze, the kind of professional picture that cost real money. Her biography mentioned a passion for sustainable design. Annalise stared at the picture longer than she intended to. She wasn't what Annalise had expected. That was the thing nobody ever tells you. They are usually just a person, not some evil cartoon character or a monster. Just someone who made a very deliberate over and over for 4 months straight. She closed the browser tab. The thing about actually finding out the real not the movie version, was that it didn't feel like a big explosion. It felt like the opposite. It was like pressure being released, like something pulled tight for months had finally gone limp. She had known. That was the heavy fact sitting on her chest. For weeks, she had known in that way you know things you are not ready to say out loud. The note in her phone, the folder in her nightstand, the 3 doctor's appointments she attended all by herself. Her body had been preparing even while her mind was trying to deny it. She opened the note on her phone and added 3 new lines. Confirmed. Email chain. 4 months. Hotel receipt November 3rd matches credit card. Her name is Colette Monroe, associate at the firm. Then she leaned back and placed a hand on her stomach. The baby moved, a long, slow roll that she could feel in her palm. Yeah, she said out loud to the quiet kitchen. I know. At noon, she called her friend Desta. Desta Lawson had been her closest friend since they worked together 6 years ago, before Desta went freelance and Annalise got married, and their lives drifted apart. They still talk twice a week. Desta was the person who told her 3 years ago, I just want you to be sure about him. And then she dropped it when Annalise said she was sure, because that is what good friends do. Hey, Desta said when she answered. How are you feeling? I need to tell you something. A pause. Okay, not on the phone. Can you come over? I am on a client call until 2. After that, I can Desta. Another shorter pause. I will move it. Give me 45 minutes. Desta sat across from her at the kitchen table and looked at the screenshots without a word. She was perfectly still, the way a person is when they are holding back a lot. When she saw the hotel receipt, she set the phone down carefully, as if to stop herself from throwing it. 4 months, she said. That is what I can document. Could be longer. And she was here. Last night in your house, in the guest room as far as I know. Desta just looked at her. Annalise, I know. You are 30 weeks pregnant. I know that, too. What do you need? Desta asked. Just that. It was the direct question, and that is why Annalise had called her. I need to know what my options actually look like, Annalise said. Not what I imagine they are, but real information. Desta nodded slowly. She was already picking up her phone. My cousin Mara went through a divorce 2 years ago. Her lawyer was supposed to be excellent. Let me find the name. She did not sleep well for the next 3 nights. It was not because of crying or falling apart. She was not doing either of those things yet. She was keeping it all in a box she had not opened, filing it away with the screenshots and the credit card statements in that folder. She could not sleep because her mind would not stop running through the logistics, the house, the accounts. The timing 30 weeks meant 10 more to go. That meant a newborn and a divorce at the same time. She needed to think about this now, not later, after things calmed down, but right now. She made lists. She Googled things she never thought she would have to Google. She texted the lawyer at 7 in the morning on a Wednesday, and she got a response by 9. Rowan came and went. He was warmer those days, she noticed, attentive in a careful way. The way you are when you know you have done something wrong and are waiting to see if you have been caught. He asked about the baby. He said she should rest more. He made dinner one night, pasta, and set the table. She ate it. She said, thank you. She kept making her lists. The consultation was on a Thursday in an office building downtown, with a lobby that smelled of carpet cleaner and an elevator that took forever. The attorney's name was Patricia Cole. She was in her mid-50s, wore a practical gray blazer, and spoke in a way that was direct but not unkind. Annalise sat across from her with her folder and a clear head and laid out everything she had. Cole listened, asked 3 questions, and looked at the credit card statements and the hotel receipt. Oregon is a no-fault state, she said. That means the affair itself does not change the outcome, but proof of marital waste money spent on the affair is very relevant. You've done good work here, Cole repeated. Annalise wrote that down. Given the pregnancy, Cole went on, the timing is something to discuss. You do not have to file before the birth, but establishing your intentions now has advantages. It creates a paper trail and a clear timeline. Courts look at the date of separation, not the date you file. Annalise nodded. So, if she documented the date, she decided exactly. She drove home across the Burnside Bridge as rain hit the windshield, the wipers moving in that weird rhythm they'd had all spring. She missed her exit and headed back through the Pearl District, right past the block where the Nines Hotel stood. She did not look at it. She looked at the road. That night, Rowan came home at 7. A normal time for once. She heard him in the kitchen, opening the fridge, making the sound of a man who just assumes dinner will appear. There's leftover soup, she called from the bedroom. Thanks. A pause. Have you eaten? Yeah. She heard the microwave start. She sat on the bed, her laptop open, reading the lawyer's follow-up email. It was a list of documents to gather, accounts to take pictures of, and things to record before anything changed. She worked through it all methodically, the way she would on a spreadsheet. When she was done, she closed the laptop and just sat in the quiet. The microwave beeped downstairs. The rain started again. She opened the nightstand drawer, put the folder inside, then took it out again and held it on her lap. 10 weeks left, more or less. 10 weeks to get everything in order. She was going to need every single one of them. She put the folder back on the nightstand, turned off the lamp, and lay down in the dark. Her hand automatically found her stomach. "We are going to be okay," she thought to herself. She just was not sure yet if she believed it. She was going to keep saying it until she did. At 11:58 p.m., her phone lit up. A text from a number she didn't recognize, 3 words. She read it once, then she took a screenshot. The text said, "He chose you. For now." No name, no context, just that. Sitting on her screen at midnight like a stone dropped into still water, she lay awake for 2 hours, turning it over and over. For now. The wording was deliberate. Someone wanted her to feel how unstable this was, the conditional nature of her own marriage. Someone who got Annalise's number from Rowan's phone, meaning they were physically near it. It meant the guest room story was either a lie or didn't matter. By 2 a.m., she'd made a decision. Not the big one. That was already made. Somewhere around the 3rd appointment she'd attended alone, hardening quietly in the lawyer's office on Southwest Broadway. This was a smaller, more practical decision. She was done waiting for the perfect moment. There was no perfect moment. There was only getting ready, and she was going to finish it. She got up, made tea she didn't touch, and sat at the kitchen table with her laptop until 4. Oregon law, she learned, was simpler than she'd expected. A no-fault divorce meant she didn't have to prove anything in a courtroom. No dramatic presentation of screenshots. No moment where a judge would lean forward and ask, "And is this the woman?" Oregon just required that the marriage was irretrievably broken, a phrase so clinical and complete that the first time she read it, she almost laughed. Irretrievably broken. Like a coffee maker. Like a car that just wasn't worth fixing. What really mattered, Cole had told her, was documenting all marital assets and any misuse of those assets, the hotel receipts. Venmo transfers she found after digging deeper. 4 payments to a contact listed only as KM, totaling nearly $2,000 over 3 months. The joint savings account that had, she noticed on Monday morning, dropped by $8,000 since August, with no household expense she could find to explain it. She photographed everything. Bank statements, credit card PDFs, the mortgage documents from the filing cabinet in Rowan's office that she'd always had access to but never used. She saved copies to a folder on her personal laptop, not the shared drive, not iCloud where his devices also connected, and emailed duplicates to Desta and to Cole's office. She was meticulous about it, with column headers and everything sorted by date. It was the same for she had organized project files at the design agency 6 years ago. The same for she had always worked when the project actually mattered. This mattered. "You seem calm," Desta said. They were at Desta's apartment in Selwood on a Wednesday afternoon, rain hitting the windows so hard they were blurry. Desta had made soup, real soup from scratch, the kind that meant she was worried, and Annalise was on her second bowl because the baby was apparently a big fan of lentils. "I am calm," Annalise said. "That is kind of what I mean. Would you prefer it if I was not?" Desta wrapped both hands around her mug. "I would prefer you to be whatever you actually are. I am just checking in." Annalise put down her spoon. Outside, water streamed down the window. Somewhere in the building, someone was playing music too loud for a Wednesday. "Something with a bass she could feel more than hear, I think," she said slowly. "That I have been calm for a very long time. Like performing being calm, managing everything so it would not make him uncomfortable." She picked her spoon back up. "I am not performing right now. I just know what I am doing. That is..." Desta looked at her for a moment. "Okay," she said, "good. Also, I cried in the Victor Joe's parking lot on Monday for 11 minutes, so it is not like I am a robot." Desta snorted. "Which one?" "The one on Interstate. The cart return was broken, and I could not figure out where to put my cart, and then she made a gesture. The cart return broke you. The cart broke me." They sat with that for a second. Then Desta let out a real laugh, and Annalise laughed, too, and it felt like something was finally unclenching. She had started sleeping in the guest room. not the one Caleb had used. She'd stripped those sheets and threw them directly in the trash, a choice she didn't think about too much, but the smaller one at the end of the hall, the one they had vaguely discussed as a nursery but never decided on. She moved her pillow, her phone charger, and that novel she couldn't focus on. That first night, she got 5 hours of uninterrupted sleep, the most she'd had in 3 weeks. Rowan didn't say a thing, and that told her everything. He was still playing it safe with that cautious warmth, asking about her appointments and getting home before 10 on most nights. She wondered if Caleb was told to give her space, to just let things cool down. It felt like a strategic retreat from someone who understood timing. She wondered if they had planned it out together in some hotel room. She couldn't let herself get stuck on that thought. It didn't help, and she had work to do, like figuring out the nursery situation. This was the one thing she had not fully faced yet, the practical reality of a newborn. The apartment she had toured with Desta in early November was a 2-bedroom in a building near Lad's Addition on the 2nd floor, with hardwood floors that creaked in a different way than the ones here. A window in the bedroom faced east. She had stood in that room for a long time doing the math. A crib against that wall, a changing table under the window, morning light. It was 1,400 square feet, nothing like this house. She signed the lease on a Friday afternoon, with Desta sitting in the building's small lobby on her phone, while Annalise sat with the property manager and paid the first and last month's rent from personal sources. The one from before marriage, the one she'd kept separate, a decision she made without knowing why but now understood completely. She drove home over the Hawthorne Bridge with the signed lease in her bag and said nothing to anyone. Cole called on Thursday. "I have reviewed everything you sent. The documentation is strong." He paused. "I want to talk about timing." "Okay. Given your due date, you have a few options. File now, which establishes this timeline clearly and gets things moving, but means managing the process while you are pregnant. Or you can wait until after the birth, which gives you recovery time, but the separation date is less clean. Or, and this is what some clients in your situation prefer, you prepare everything now and file on a specific date that you choose. You control the timing." Annalise looked at the wall. "What would you recommend?" "I would recommend whatever puts you in the most stable position, both practically and emotionally. You know your situation better than I do. What does the filing process look like on the day of? You submit the petition. He gets served. It can be done by a process server, certified as mail, or he can accept the service voluntarily. His response period is 30 days, and if he is home when it is filed." Cole was quiet for a moment. "Are you asking if you need to be present?" "I am asking if I should be." Another pause. "No," Cole said, "you do not." She quietly began to move things, not furniture, nothing obvious, just the things that were specifically hers, a box of photographs from before they were married, her grandmother's silver that she got after her mother passed it down, the external hard drive with 7 years of her own freelance design work on it, books she had bought for herself, a small watercolor her college roommate had painted for her, things that would be hard to argue over because they had never really been shared. She moved them in her car over 3 Tuesday mornings. Rowan was reliably at the office by 8 a.m. The new apartment started receiving boxes that she stacked against the wall in the smaller bedroom. The building supervisor, a quiet man in his 60s named Walt, held the elevator for her once without asking any questions. She really appreciated that. The baby came with her, of course, rolling and kicking at stoplights, at the sound of packing tape, at the particular quiet of an empty apartment that was slowly becoming something else. "You are going to like this room," Annalise thought, standing in the east-facing bedroom with the afternoon light coming through the window. "You are going to like the mornings here." The week before she had planned to file, Rowan sat across from her at the kitchen table and said he wanted to talk about the baby shower. She just looked at him. "Your friends were apparently asking Desta about it, whether we were going to have one." He had his hands wrapped around his coffee mug, the posture of a man who had decided to try. "I thought maybe we could do something at the house. Keep it small, just your people." She waited to feel something. Anger, perhaps, or that specific sickness of watching someone fake being normal. Instead, she just felt very far away, like she was watching from a great distance. "That is okay," she said. "Desta is handling it."
Okay. He nodded. Okay. Good. He looked down at his coffee. How are you? How are you doing?
"Really?" The kitchen smelled like the burnt toast he had made that morning, and had not bothered to clean up. The floods of the stove rattled whenever it ran on high. She had been meaning to tell him about it. "I am good," she said. "Really?" He nodded. He seemed almost relieved. She watched him carry out of relief out of the kitchen and go upstairs, and then she sat for a moment in the quiet. 7 days. She had 7 days. She went to her final planning appointment with Cole the following Monday. She signed the documents that needed her signature and left the office with a specific date on her calendar. The drive home was 40 minutes. Traffic on the 26 West was a crawl, the kind of afternoon gridlock that was just a fact of life in the city, like the rain or the Blazers losing in the playoffs. She sat in silence, no radio on. The wipers swiped back and forth. The heat was on because a chill kept getting into her hands lately. She thought about the east-facing window. She thought about sunlight in the morning. She thought about her daughter. She had known it was a girl since week 20, but had only told Desta. She imagined her growing up in rooms where no one was putting on an act, where the heat wasn't adjusted for someone else's comfort, where being calm meant things were actually calm. She took the inside exit and drove the rest of the way home. That night, she cooked dinner. Pasta the same kind she'd bought for years, from a box she had already decided to leave behind. She made plenty for them both. They ate at the table, and Rowan talked about work. A project delay. A problem with a contractor, and she just listened. She nodded and asked a question when it seemed like he expected one. She did the dishes. She said good night. Then she went to the guest room, climbed into bed, and lay in the dark with one hand on her belly. Her phone was on the nightstand. The folder was now in her bag. It had been there for 4 days, ready. 7 days to go had turned into 6. She closed her eyes. The old house groaned around her. The third stair creaked, the faucet dripped, the fridge hummed down the hall. She had learned to live with all these sounds, and she would not miss a single one. Outside, the neighbor's dog finally stopped barking. Her alarm was set for 6 a.m. She had already confirmed everything with Cole. The woman serving the papers was named Donna. Annalise knew because Cole's office mentioned it in the confirmation email. Donna Reyes will handle service. Estimated window 9 a.m. to 11 a.m. She had read that line so many times this past week that the name was stuck in her head like the lyrics to a song. It would pop into her head at random moments. Donna Reyes, 9 to 11. She was at Desta's apartment by 8:15. Desta answered the door in a sweatshirt, coffee already brewed. She only said, "Couch or kitchen?" Annalise said kitchen. And for the first 20 minutes, that was their whole conversation. They sat there while Desta worked, and Annalise stared at her phone as rain hit the windows and the old building-'s heating system hissed and knocked. At 9:47, her phone buzzed. It was a text from Cole's office. Service completed. 9:43 accepted at the door. Annalise read it, then read it again. She put her phone face down on the table, then picked it back up. "Done?" Desta asked, not looking up from her laptop. "Done." Desta shut her computer.
Okay, she said. What do you need right now?
"I have no idea," Annalise said, and that was the absolute truth. She heard Rowan's side of the story from the man himself. He called at 22. She let it go to voicemail. He called again at 10:31. She listened to the message in Desta's hallway, the phone pressed tightly to her ear. His voice sounded different. Not angry, not yet. But it was missing the careful warmth he'd been faking for the past 2 weeks. It was flatter. The voice of a man who just had the rug pulled out from under him and hadn't quite figured out how to fall yet. "Annalise, call me back. I need to understand what's happening. Call me." She texted Cole's office to confirm she got their message. Then she put her phone away in her bag. She waited 3 days before she went back to the house. She stayed at Desta's, on the couch which Desta had made up with real sheets and a proper pillow. No fake guest situation here. And she spent those days quietly focused on not falling apart. She slept. She ate the food that Desta always seemed to have in her magically well-stocked kitchen. She went to her 34-week appointment by herself. At this point, that felt totally normal. She sat in the waiting room, filled out the forms, and thought about her east-facing window. Rowan texted 7 times. He called 4 more. She ignored all of it. On the second day, a text came from a number she'd blocked and unblocked twice before. She was pretty sure it was Calithways, a different number from the one she used before, but the words had the same tone. It said, "You're making this harder than it needs to be." She took a screenshot and sent it to Cole without a reply. The house felt strange when she walked in on Thursday morning. Smaller, maybe. Or maybe she was just seeing it in a new way. Not as her home, but as a problem with dimensions that she needed to solve. She moved through the house with purpose. The things she'd already packed were gone. The rest of her belongings still here. She put them into the last 2 boxes in the hall closet. Rowan was at the office. She'd made sure of that before she came over. She packed quickly. The watercolor painting she had almost left behind. The box of her grandmother's recipe cards that had been in a kitchen drawer for years, hidden behind junk mail and coupons. The baby monitor she'd ordered 2 months ago and hadn't even opened. She loaded it all into her car, then stood in the kitchen for one last moment. The coffee maker on the counter gurgled. It was 15 years old, she guessed. Maybe older. It had been his when they first got married. The crack in the floor tile by the back door had been there from day one. The hook where she had hung her keys every day for 3 years now showed a faint outline on the wall, the ghost of an old habit. Slid her key off the ring and left it on the counter. Then she walked out. Call from Rowan's sister came on Friday afternoon. She hadn't expected that. Bridget Whitaker was 46, a practical woman from Bend who had always treated with a neutral distance, as if she was saving her judgment for later. They weren't close, just polite. Annalise almost didn't answer the phone. "I'm not calling to take sides," Bridget said right away. "I want to be clear about that." "Okay." "He called me." A brief silence. "He's not handling this well, I can imagine." He said. She hesitated, then started over. "He said he didn't think you knew." Annalise didn't say anything. Outside, a car drove past with the bass turned up way too loud. She was sitting in her car in the apartment building's parking lot with groceries in the back seat. "I knew," she said. There was a long silence on Bridget's end of the line. "Okay," Bridget finally said. "I'm sorry, Annalise. Thank you for calling." She sat in the parking lot for a while after she hung up. The groceries could wait. The baby was pushing against her ribs on the right side, a firm, steady pressure she'd come to think of as the baby's way of saying, "I'm here." "I know you are," she whispered. The gossip about the firm started making the rounds in the 3rd week of December. She didn't start it. She wanted to make that clear later when she told the story to Cole, and then to Desta, and finally to herself. She hadn't made any calls. She hadn't posted a thing online. What happened was Rowan's business partner, Graham Doherty, had apparently also noticed the $8,000 and some other strange financial activity. And Graham had started asking his own questions. She heard about it from Desta, who heard it from a friend who worked at another firm downtown. By that point, the story had a life of its own. She didn't call Graham, but she did not call him either. She just sent Cole the bank records and let him handle whatever came next. The one big moment she heard about directly came from Desta, whose friend had actually been there to see it. It happened on a Tuesday, at a firm lunch on Northwest 23rd. It was one of those long table, 12-person, end-of-the-year events. In front of everyone, Graham asked Rowan a very direct question about a client's escrow account. He didn't yell or make a scene, just asked it across the table, where 12 people suddenly became fascinated by their water glasses. Rowan did not have a good answer. By Wednesday, 2 of the firm's junior architects had already updated their LinkedIn profiles. Colette Monroe gave her notice the following Monday. Annalise learned this from Cole, who found out during the discovery process, which was now moving forward on its own. She read the line in Cole's email. "The associate has separated from the firm effective December 20th. And she sat with that for a second in the east-facing bedroom. The half-built crib was against the wall, and the winter light coming through the window was flat and clean. She remembered staring at that LinkedIn photo for way too long. The sharp face, the intense stare, a passion for adaptive reuse. She closed the email. She finally told her mother on a Sunday night. They were on a video call from her new kitchen. The light was too bright, and a half-eaten bowl of cereal sat on the counter. A dinner had been cereal, which seemed perfectly fine. Her mother was silent for a long time after Annalise finished her story. "How long did you know?" she asked. "A few weeks before I did anything. And you went through all of this by yourself? With Desta and a lawyer." Her mother just looked at her through the screen. She was 63, and she'd been through her own version of this in her 40s. The amount to a life that was nothing like she had planned, but suited her much better. She didn't say, "I told you so." She didn't say, "I knew it." She just looked at Annis for a good long while. "You doing okay?" "Just that." "I think so," Annalise said. "Ask me again in a few months." Her mother nodded. "I'm coming for the birth. Don't even argue." Annalise didn't. The last week of December was brutally cold, the kind with teeth, which Portland didn't get every winter. For 4 days straight, she wore the same oversized sweater. It was warm, comfortable, and besides, there was no one around to notice. She put the cook together herself, using a YouTube tutorial and a level of determination that struck her as funny. 33 weeks pregnant, on her knees, hex wrench in hand, pausing the video every 45 seconds. 2 hours later, it was done. She stood up slowly, a hand on the wall for balance, and just looked at it. A crib in a room with an east-facing window in an apartment with her name on the lease. Her phone was on the floor. She picked it up. A 7th text from Rowan in 4 days. She read it once, and then put the phone down without replying. Another text came through from her mother. "Flight booked, January 14th. Then one from Desta. "Dinner tomorrow? I'll come to you." She typed back, "Yes, bring the soup." She slipped the phone into her pocket and walked to the kitchen. The faucet in this apartment didn't drip. Nora arrived on January 19th at 6:52 in the morning. 7 pounds, 4 ounces, a full head of dark hair, and a cry that started small before finding its power and filling the room. Annalise's mother was there. She had been since the 14th, sleeping on the pull-out couch and recessed stock of the fridge without being asked. The way mothers do when they've been through it and know what really helps. Desta had been in the waiting room since 3 in the morning. She came in 20 minutes later with red eyes, a smile that she couldn't hold back, and she said nothing useful for a whole minute, which was perfect. The nurse laid Nora on Annalise's chest. She was warm and heavier than expected, so solid, so real. A whole person who already had opinions and was showing them by rooting against the hospital gown with serious focus. "Hi," Annalise thought. "I have been waiting for you." The first weeks were hard, in ways she was prepared for and in ways she was not. She expected the lack of sleep, the endless needs of a newborn, and the physical recovery that no one ever really describes honestly. She had read the books, set up the bassinet perfectly, and knew all about cluster feeding. But knowing about it didn't make it easier. It just meant she could identify what was happening as it happened, which was something. The parts she wasn't prepared for were much quieter. One night in the second week, Nora was finally asleep after a 2-hour ordeal. Annalise was sitting on the couch in the dark at 4 a.m. A cup of tea was getting cold next to her, and that was when she cried for the first time. It wasn't grief, not for Rowan or the marriage, not even for herself. It was more like a pressure release. Everything she had locked away was finally moving through her in the dark living room as her daughter slept 8 feet away. It went on for maybe 20 minutes. Then she drank her cold tea, rinsed the cup, and went to bed. Her mother didn't bring it up.
She just arrived in the morning with a breakfast sandwich written from the place on Division Street and put it on the counter.
The divorce became final on March 14th. It had moved much more quickly than her lawyer, Cole, had predicted. Rowan hadn't fought much of it, which surprised her until Cole explained that fighting leads to discovery, and discovery would have revealed things Rowan wanted to keep hidden. His own attorney had advised him to cooperate, and so he did. The 90-day countdown had begun in December, which made the March finalization clean and fast. There were no requests for extensions, no extra motions filed, nothing was dragged out. The settlement was fair. Oregon law wasn't about punishment, it was about what the documents proved. The joint savings account was divided. She bought out his portion of the house equity, which gave her a check that covered the new apartment's lease for the rest of the year, with some left over. Child support was set at the state guideline, with automatic payments starting April 1st. She the final papers in Cole's office on a Tuesday morning, with Nora asleep in a carrier strapped to her chest. Cole slid the pages across his desk one by one. Annalise signed each page. The pen was one of those heavy metal ones that law firms have, and it left a solid, definite line with every signature. When it was all done, Cole said, "Congratulations." He wasn't being sarcastic. It wasn't an empty platitude. It was just what you say when something is truly finished. "Thank you," Annalise said, "for everything." She took the slow elevator down to the lobby and walked out onto SW Broadway. It was a cold, overcast March morning, and it felt completely, ordinarily fine. Her mother stayed for 3 weeks after Nora was born. The best night was during week 2, around 3 in the morning. Nora was in the middle of a relentless fussy period, and Annalise had been awake since midnight. She walked into the living room and found her mother already up, sitting in the armchair with a dim light on, a warm mug in her hands. She didn't say a word, just moved her feet to make room on the ottoman. Annalise sat on the couch holding Nora, and they just stayed like that. 2 women and a newborn in the quiet apartment, as her mother said, without any warning. It gets louder before it gets quieter. The grief part, I mean.
"I know," Annalise replied. "No, you don't. Not yet. I don't mean that to be harsh. It's just a fact. But you will, and it's okay. It doesn't mean anything went wrong."
Annalise looked at her daughter's sleeping face. "How long did it take?" she asked. "For you?" Her mother thought for a moment. 2 years before it stopped being the first thing I thought of in the morning. 4 years before I stopped comparing everything to how it was before. She sipped her tea. "But the part where you feel like yourself again? That came much faster than I expected. That part surprised me." "Okay," Annalise said. Her mother simply nodded. They never had to talk about it again. She started freelancing again at 8 weeks postpartum. 2 clients, a few small projects, the kind of work she could do during Nora's naps when her brain wasn't quite at 100%. By April, she had added a 3rd client. By May, she was turning down work that she did not want, a feeling she had forgotten she was allowed to have. She had also raised her rate. She did it intentionally, looking at what she had charged for years and increasing it by 30%, based on finally being the only person she had to answer to. Most clients paid it without a second thought. The ones who argued, she simply let go. No negotiation. That felt important. She wrote it in the Notes app on her phone on a brand new list. Raised rate. Let the pushback go, didn't explain. Rowan's weekends with Nora started in April. Saturday morning to Sunday evening, just like the agreement said. The first time they met was in the parking lot of a coffee shop on Hawthorne Neutral Ground, as Cole had suggested. Rowan was 5 minutes early. He looked different. Not destroyed, which she had braced herself for, and was almost glad he wasn't. But he seemed smaller, somehow. Like something that had been inflated and then slowly deflated. He held Nora with the kind of careful terror of someone who is not yet confident. Annalise watched him figure out how to hold her against his chest, and she felt something that wasn't sympathy and wasn't satisfaction. It was something in between, something more honest. "She likes the car," Annalise said. "She usually fusses for the first 5 minutes, then she's out." He nodded without looking up. "Rowan?" He looked at her. "She does not need to know anything except that you love her. That is the only thing that has to be consistent." He nodded again. His jaw was tight, the way it got when he was holding something back. She handed him the diaper bag, confirmed the pickup time for Sunday, and walked back to her car. She sat for a moment before starting the engine. Her hands were steady. She specifically checked for any shaking and found none. She drove home and made coffee and stood in her kitchen, which smelled only of her own apartment. It smelled like the candle Desta had brought, Nora's clean newborn smell, and the coffee itself, which was better than her old coffee maker, because she'd bought a new one in February for $60 that didn't wheeze. She heard the news about the firm in May from Graham Doherty's wife, Carol. She had run into her at the farmers market at Shimisky Park one Saturday morning. They weren't close friends, just from holiday parties and the occasional dinner, but Karen stopped when she saw Annalise, looked at Nora in the carrier and said, "She is beautiful." "Oh, thank you." Karen was quiet for a second. The market was loud around them, with someone selling jam giving a demonstration to a small, laughing crowd. You could smell kettle corn. "Graham wanted me to tell you," she said carefully, that the audit found what it found, that it had nothing to do with you. But also, she paused, he is sorry it took as long as it did. Annalise understood exactly what she meant without needing it spelled out. Thank you, she said again. Tell him I appreciate it. Karen nodded, lightly touched Nora's foot, and walked away. The firm restructured that June. Graham bought out Rowan's share for a price that Annalise heard was much, much lower than it would have been before December. The building they leased was in a decent part of southwest Portland, the kind of rest that had set some weight in their industry. Rowan's name was taken off the directory. She didn't celebrate it. It wasn't her victory to claim. Instead, she put Nora in the stroller and walked the East Bank Esplanade on a Tuesday afternoon when the sun finally came out. It was one of those perfect Portland June days that makes up for all the gray ones, warm and clean, with the river looking like flat silver. She walked for an hour and a half with no destination in mind, which was new for her. By August, Nora could sit up with a little help and would squeal with delight at the mobile over her crib, making a specific sound that was definitely communication. Annalise recorded it all on her phone, just like she did with everything. She had 17 videos in a folder, organized by month. In her head, they were all subtitled, "Proof this is really happening." She had started going to therapy back in April. Every other Thursday, she'd go to a small office in northwest Portland with a white noise machine outside the door. Her therapist was Dr. Ren Foster, patient, direct, and not one for letting things spiral, which Annalise liked. How's the anger? She would ask. Quieter, Annalise would answer, and it was the truth. The anger had been a roaring fire in February, a dark, cold month full of paperwork, but it had passed through her and was now just a low hum in the background. And the grief, Dr. Foster would ask. Different, she'd say. I'm grieving the life I thought I had, not the one I actually had. Dr. Foster would nod, jot something down, and move on. The baby shower was in early January, just 12 days before Nora was born. Desta organized it at her apartment in Selwood. 9 people, good cheese, and absolutely no games. Rowan was not invited. It never even came up. Sat on Desta's couch with a plate of food she actually ate, and for the first time in months she felt like herself. Just simply herself. As for Caleb Monroe, from what Annalise could gather, she had taken a job at a firm up in Seattle. She never looked her up. She just heard about it from an old colleague at a housewarming party in September. It was mentioned in passing, like an old story that had lost its power. That same person also told her that Caleb left Portland by herself. Rowan hadn't gone with her. Apparently, they'd had a talk in January where it became clear his promises of a house and a future weren't going to happen. The colleague said this with a certain flatness, the way people talk about they find satisfying but won't admit it. Annalise just nodded and filed the information away. The architecture scene in Portland was small, so Caleb leaving made its own quiet waves. A few people knew why, and many more had guessed. Seattle was close enough to be an escape, but far enough for a new start. Annalise genuinely didn't know if she'd managed to start over, and she had stopped caring. At that same party, she heard from someone else that Rowan had started seeing someone new. She waited for a feeling to hit her, but found mostly nothing, just a strange hint of hope that things would go well for him, which surprised her at first. After all, Nora had his eyes. That was a fact. No matter how she felt about everything else, she didn't want Nora's father to be miserable for the next 18 years. It just seemed practical. She told Dr. Foster that, and her therapist said, "That's a very mature way to look at it." Annalise replied, "Or it's just self-interest." Dr. Foster had smiled at that. Her apartment on a Saturday in October was filled with sunlight. She'd stopped thinking of it as a temporary place around month 3. She bought a real couch, a coffee table, and a perfect, oversized rug for the living room. She hung art on the walls and even had a plant in the kitchen that was still alive. Nora was on the playmat. At 9 months old, she was very serious about her research into cause and effect, which Annalise found hilarious. The toy with the spinning part got a thorough inspection. The cloth book was tasted and approved. The stuffed dog from Desta was examined from 3 different angles. She's going to be methodical, Annalise thought. She's going to want all the facts before making a decision. She could work with that. That evening, she called her mother. a Sunday night ritual that had become comfortable and easy. "How are you?" her mom asked. Annalise was on the couch, Nora was asleep next door, and the apartment was quiet. A candle was lit. It was just right. Outside the window, the October darkness settled in, with streetlights reflecting on the wet pavement. She thought about the question for a real moment, instead of just giving an automatic answer. "Good," she said. "I think I'm actually good. Not just putting on a show? No, not performing." Her mother was silent on the other end for a moment, a comfortable silence. "That's all I ever wanted for you," she said. They talked until the candle burned down. Annalise lit it. Nora turned one on Saturday in January. Desta brought her famous homemade soup, a joke that became a tradition. Annalise flew in from her retirement home in Tucson, a direct flight with no complaints about the weather. 3 friends from her old design firm came with their partners and their own little kids. The apartment became a happy, chaotic mess in the way only close friends can make a small space feel. Nora ate her cupcake with intense, focused joy. She used both hands, got frosting all over her face, and everyone took about 11 pictures of it. Rowan came by for an hour in the afternoon. He brought a nice, age-appropriate wooden block toy and sat on the floor with Nora as she checked it out. There was a moment when he looked up and caught Annalise watching him. Their eyes met for a second. Something can pass between them. It wasn't exactly forgiveness, and it wasn't quite peace, but it was close to both. It was something survivable. She left before dinner, and she walked him to the door. "She's amazing," he said. "Yeah," Annalise replied. "She is." The door closed. She stood in the hall for a moment, then rejoined the party. Later, after everyone was gone and her mother had done all the dishes without being asked, Annalise sat alone in the kitchen with the last of the soup. The apartment was quiet, with that specific feeling of a good day ending. It wasn't an empty quiet. It was a full quiet, the difference between a room that's been abandoned and one that's been lived in and is now at rest. She thought about the person she was 2 Januaries ago. 32 weeks pregnant. Awake at 2 in the morning in a house where she was faking a life, listening to a man she trusted laugh with someone she'd never met. The folder in the nightstand. The note on her phone. The cold, certain knowledge of what was coming, and the terrifying uncertainty of what came after. She couldn't have explained this to that version of herself. She wouldn't have known how. But what she could say now, from this kitchen, with warm soup and her daughter asleep in the next room, was that after had turned out to be livable. More than livable. After turned out to be hers. Its shape, its rhythm, its special kind of quiet were all things she had chosen. She wasn't shrinking herself down to fit someone else's life anymore. That was something she never knew she wanted. Now she couldn't imagine life without it. In the morning, Nora woke up at 6:15. Annalise heard her before the baby monitor even chirped. She always did. It was like her daughter's sounds were on a special frequency that cut right through sleep. She padded down the hall in her wool socks, the floorboards creaking. She knew all the sounds of this building now. She pushed open the door. The east window was letting in the morning light. It was that pale winter light of January, coming in clean over the crib. Nora was standing, both hands on the rail, pulling herself up. She was concentrating, testing her theory. She had never done that before, at least not while Annalise was watching. She looked up as the door opened, and her face lit up in that special way it did. In that moment, they truly saw each other. "Hi," Annalise whispered. Nora held the rail, met her mother's eyes, and just laughed. They stood like that as the light poured in. It makes you wonder, what was the moment you knew you were living your own life, not just playing a part for someone else? Let us know in the comments. We read every comment.
Thanks for watching. Your feedback is so important, so please leave a comment to tell us what you think and where you are watching. Do not forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. Your support helps us to continue, so please share this with someone who would love it.